Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I am now reading part 3 of The New World Order by H.G. Wells. Chapter 7, Federation. Let us now take up certain vaguely constructive proposals which seem at present to be very much in people's minds. They find their cardinal expression in a book called Union Now by Mr. Clarence K. Strite, which has launched the magic word federation upon the world. The democracies of the world are to get together upon a sort of enlargement of the federal Constitution of the United States, which produced one of the bloodiest civil wars in all history, and then all will be well with us. Let us consider whether this word federation is of any value in organizing the Western Revolution. I would suggest it is. I think it may be a means of mental release for many people who would otherwise have remained dully resistant to any sort of change. This federation project has an air of reasonableness. It is attractive to a number of influential people who wish, with the minimum of adaptation, to remain influential in a changing world, and particularly is it attractive to what I may call the liberal conservative elements of the prosperous classes in America, in Great Britain, and the Oslo countries, because it puts the most difficult aspect of the problem, the need for collective socialization, so completely in the background that it can be ignored. This enables them to take quite a bright and hopeful view of the future without any serious hindrance to their present preoccupations. They think that federation, reasonably defined, may suspend the possibility of war for a considerable period and so lighten the burden of taxation that presents crushing demands on them will relax, and they will be able to resume, on a slightly more economical scale perhaps, their former way of living. Everything that gives them hope and self-respect and preserves their home from the worst indignities of panic, appeasement, treason hunting, and the rest of it is to be encouraged. And meanwhile, their sons will have the time to think, and it may be possible so to search, ransack, and rationalize the Strite project as to make it a genuine and workable scheme for the socialization of the world. In The Fate of Homo Sapiens, I examined the word democracy with some care, since it already seemed like that great quantities of our young men were to be asked to cripple and risk their lives for its sake. I show that it was still a very incompletely realized aspiration, that its complete development involved socialism and a level of education and information attained as yet by no community in the world. Mr. Strite gives a looser, more rhetorical statement, a more idealistic statement, shall we say, of his conception of democracy, the sort of statement that would be considered widely exaggerated even if it was war propaganda. And though unhappily it is remote from any achieved reality, he proceeds without further inquiry, as if it were a description of existing realities in what he calls the democracies of the world. In them, he imagines he finds governments of the people, by the people, and for the people. In the book I have already cited, I discuss what is democracy and where is democracy. I do my best there to bring Mr. Strite down to the harsh and difficult facts of the case. I will go now a little more into particulars in my examination of his project. His founder democracies are to be the American Union, the British Commonwealth, specifically the United Kingdom, the Federal Dominion of Canada, the Commonwealth of Australia, New Zealand, the Union of South Africa, Ireland, the French Republic, Belgium, the Netherlands, the Swiss Confederation, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. Scarcely one of these, as I have shown in that former book, is really a fully working democracy. And the Union of South Africa is particularly bad and dangerous case of race tyranny. Ireland is an incipient religious war in not one country but two. Poland, I note, does not come into Mr. Strite's list of democracies at all. His book was written in 1938 when Poland was a totalitarian country holding in defiance the League of Nations, Vilna, which it had taken from Lithuania. Large areas of non-Polish country it had conquered from Russia, and fragments gained by the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia. It only became a democracy, even technically, and for a brief period before its collapse in September 1939, when Mr. Chamberlain was so foolish as to drag the British Empire into a costly, perilous war on its behalf. But that is by the way. None of these 15 or 10 founder democracies are really democracies at all, so we start badly. but they might be made socialist democracies, and their federation might be made something very real indeed, at a price. The USSR is a federated socialist system, which has shown a fairly successful political solidarity during the past 2 decades, whatever else it has done or failed to do. Now let us help Mr. Streit to convert his federation from a noble but extremely rhetorical aspiration into a living reality. He is aware that this must be done at a price, but I want to suggest that the price is, from what I judge to be his point of view, far greater, and the change much simpler, more general, and possibly even closer at hand than he supposes. He is disposed to appeal to existing administrative organizations, and it is questionable whether they are the right people to execute his designs. One of the difficulties he glosses over is the possible reluctance of the India office to hand over the control of India, Ceylon, and Burma, he does not mention, to the new Federation government, which would also, I presume, take charge of the fairly well-governed and happy 50-odd million people of Dutch East Indies, the French colonial empire, the West Indies, and so on. This, unless he proposes merely to rechristen the India office, etc., is asking for an immense outbreak of honesty and competence on the part of the new federal officialdom. It is also treating the possible contribution of these 500 or 600 million of dusky peoples to the new order with a levity inconsistent with democratic ideals. Quite a lot of these people have brains which are as good or better than normal European brains. You could educate the whole world to the not yet very exalted level of a Cambridge graduate in a single lifetime if you had schools, colleges, apparatus, and teachers enough. The radio, the cinema, the gramophone, the improvements in both production and distribution have made it possible to increase the range and effectiveness of gifted teacher 1,000-fold. We have seen intensive war preparations galore, but no one has dreamt yet of an intensive educational effort. None of us really like to see other people being educated. They may be getting an advantage over our privileged selves. Suppose we overcome that primitive jealousy. Suppose we speed up, as we are now physically able to do, the education and enfranchisement of these huge underdeveloped reservoirs of human capacity. Suppose we tack that on the Union Now idea. Suppose we stipulate that the Federation, whatever it extends, means a new and powerful education. In Bengal and Java and the Congo Free State, quite as much as in Tennessee or Georgia or Scotland or Ireland. But suppose we think a little less about gradual enfranchisement by votes and experiments in local autonomy and all these old ideas and a little more about the enfranchisement of the mind. Suppose we drop that old cant about politically immature peoples. There is one direction in which Mr. Streit's proposals are open to improvement. Let us turn to another in which he does not seem to have realized all the implications of his proposal. This great union is to have a union money and a union customs-free economy. What follows upon that? More, I think, than he realizes. There is one aspect of money to which the majority of those that discuss it seem to be incurably blind. You cannot have a theory of money or any plan about money by itself in the air. Money is not a thing in itself. It is a working part of an economic system. Money varies in its nature with laws and ideas of property in a community. As a community moves towards collectivism and communism, for example, money simplifies out. Money is a necessary in a communism as it is in any other system. But its function therein is at its simplest. Payment in kind to the worker gives him no freedom of choice among the goods the community produces. Money does. Money becomes the incentive that works the worker and nothing more. But directly you allow individuals not only to obtain goods for consumption, but also to obtain credit to produce material for types of production outside the staple production of the state. The question of credit and debt arises, and money becomes more complicated. With every liberation of this or that product or service from collective control to business or experimental exploitation, the play of the money system enlarges and the laws regulating what you may find take for it. The company laws, bankruptcy laws, and so forth increase. In any highly developed collective system, the administration will certainly have to give credits for hopeful experimental enterprises. When the system is not collectivism, monetary operations for gain are bound to creep in and become more and more complicated. Where most of the substantial side of life is entrusted to uncoordinated private enterprise, the intricacy of the money apparatus increases enormously. Monetary manipulation becomes a greater and greater factor in the competitive struggle, not only between individuals and firms, but between states. As Mr. Streit himself shows in an excellent discussion of the abandonment of the gold standard, inflation and deflation become devices in international competition. Money becomes strategic, just as a pipeline and railways can become strategic. This being so, it is plain that for the Federal Union, a common money means an identical economic life throughout the Union. And this too is implied also in Mr. Streit's customs-free economy. It is impossible to have a common money when a dollar or a pound or whatever it is can buy this, that, or the other advantage in one state and is debarred from anything but bare purchases for consumption in another. So that this Federal Union is bound to be a uniform economic system. There can be only very slight variations in the control of economic life. In the preceding sections, the implacable forces that make for the collectivization of the world or disaster have been exposed. It follows that federation means particularly uniform socialism within the federal limits, leading as state after state is incorporated to world socialism. There manifestly we carry Mr. Streit further than he realizes he goes as yet. For it is fairly evident that he is under the impression that a large measure of independent private business is to go on throughout the Union. I doubt if he imagines it is necessary to go beyond the partial socialization already achieved by the New Deal. But we have assembled evidence to show that the profit scramble, the wild days of uncorrelated business are over forever. And again, though he realizes and states very clearly that governments are made for man and not man for governments, though he applauds the great declarations of the convention that created the American Constitution, wherein we, the people of the United States, overrode the haggling of the separate states and established the American Federal Constitution, nevertheless, he is curiously chary of superseding any existing legal government in the present world. He is chary of talking of we, the people of the world. But many of us are coming to realize that all existing governments have to go into the melting pot. We believe that it is a world revolution which is upon us, and that in this great struggle to evoke a westernized world socialism, contemporary governments may vanish like straw hats in the rapids of Niagara. Mr. Streit, however, becomes extraordinarily legal-minded at this stage. I do not think that he realizes the forces of destruction that are gathering, and so I think he hesitates to plan a reconstruction upon anything like the scale that may be possible. He evades even the obvious necessity that under a federal government, the monarchies of Great Britain, Belgium, Norway, Sweden, Holland, if they survive at all, must become like the mediatized sovereigns of the component states of the former German Empire, mere ceremonial vestiges. Perhaps he thinks that, but he does not say it outright. I do not know if he has pondered the New York World Fair of 1839 or the significance of the royal visit to America in that year, and thought how much there is in the British system that would have to be abandoned if his federation is to become a reality. In most of the implications of the word, it must cease to be British. His illustrative constitution is achieved with an altogether forensic disregard of the fundamental changes in human conditions to which we have to adapt ourselves or perish. He thinks of war by itself, and not as an eruption due to deeper maladaptions, but if we push his earlier stipulations to their necessary completion, we need not trouble very much about that sample constitution of his, which is to adjust the balance so fairly among the constituent states. The abolition of distance must inevitably substitute functional associations and loyalties for local attributions, if human society does not break us up altogether. The local divisions will melt into a world collectivity, and the main conflicts in a progressively unifying federation are much more likely to be those between different worldwide types and associations of workers. So far with Union Now, one of Mr. Streit's outstanding merits is that he has had the courage to make definite proposals on which we can bite. I doubt if a European could have produced any such book. Its naive political legalism, its ideal of salvation by constitution, and its manifest faith in the magic beneficence of private enterprise are distinctly in the vein of an American, almost a pre-New Deal American, who has become, if anything, more American through his experiences of the deepening disorder of Europe. So many Americans still look on at world affairs like spectators at a ball game who are capable of vociferous participation, but still have no real sense of the participation. They do not realize that the ground is moving under their seats also, and that the social revolution is breaking surface to engulf them in their turn. To most of us, to most of us over 40 at any rate, the idea of a fundamental change in our way of life is so unpalatable that we resist it to the last moment. Mr. Strite betrays at times a vivid sense of advancing social collapse as I have, but it has still to occur to him that the collapse may be conclusive. There may be dark ages, a relapse into barbarism, but when and somehow he thinks man must recover. George Bernard Shaw has recently been saying the same thing. It may be worse than that. I have given Mr. Strite scarcely a word of praise because that would be beside the mark here. He wrote his book sincerely as a genuine contribution to the unsystematic world conference that is now going on, admitting the possibility of error, demanding criticism, and I have dealt with it in that spirit. Unfortunately, his word has gone much further than his book. His book says definite things, and even when one disagrees with it, it is good as a point of departure. But a number of people have caught up this word federation, and our minds are distracted by a multitude of appeals to supportive federal projects, with the most various content or with no content at all. All the scores and hundreds of thousands of nice people who are signing peace pledges and so forth a few years ago, without the slightest attempt in the world to understand what they meant by peace, are now echoing this new magic word with as little conception of any content for it. They did not realize that peace means so complicated and difficult in ordering and balancing of human society that it has never been sustained since man became man, and that we have wars and preparatory interludes between wars because that is a much simpler and easier sequence for our willful, muddle-headed suspicions and aggressive species. These people still think we can get this new and wonderful state of affairs just by clamoring for it. And having failed to get peace by saying peace over and over again, they now, with an immense sense of discovery, saying federation. What must happen to men in conspicuous public positions I do not know, but even an irresponsible literary man like myself finds himself inundated with innumerable lengthy private letters, hysterical postcards, pamphlets from budding organizations, declarations to sign, demands for subscriptions, all in the name of the new panacea. All as vain and unproductive as the bleating of a lost sheep. And I cannot open a newspaper without finding some eminent contemporary writing a letter to it, saying gently, firmly, and bravely the same word, sometimes with bits of union now tacked on to it, and sometimes with minor improvements, but often with nothing more than the bare idea. All sorts of idealistic movements for world peace, which have been talking quietly to themselves for years and years, have been stirred up to follow the new banner. Long before the Great War, there was a book by Sir Max Wechter, a friend of King Edward VII, advocating the United States of Europe, and that inexact but flattering parallelism to the United States of America has recurred frequently as a phrase thrown out by Monsieur Briand, for example, and as a project put forward by an Austrian-Japanese writer, Count Coudenhove Kalergi, who even devised a flag for the Union. The main objection to the idea is that there are hardly any states completely in Europe except Switzerland, San Marino, Andorra, and a few of the Versailles creations. Almost all other European states extend far beyond the European limits, both politically and in their sympathies and cultural relations. They trail with them more than half mankind, about a tenth of the British empires in Europe, and still less of the Dutch Empire, Russia, Turkey, France, are all less European than not. Spain and Portugal have their closest links with South America. Few Europeans think of themselves as Europeans. I, for example, am English, and a large part of my interests, intellectual and material, are transatlantic. I dislike calling myself British, and I like to think of myself as a member of a great English-speaking community which spreads irrespective of race and color round and about the world. I am annoyed when an American calls me a foreigner. War with America would seem to me just as insane as a war with Cornwall, and I find the idea of cutting myself off from the English-speaking peoples of America and Asia to follow the flag of my Austrian-Japanese friend into a federally bunched-up European extremely unattractive. It would, I suggest, be far easier to create the United States of the world, which is Mr. Strite's ultimate objective, than to get together the so-called continent of Europe into any sort of unity. I find most of these United States of Europe movements are now jumping onto the Federation bandwagon. My old friend and antagonist, Lord David Davies, for instance, has recently succumbed to the infection. He was concerned about the problem of a world PAX in the days when the League of Nations Society and other associated bodies were amalgamated into the League of Nations Union. He was struck then by an idea, an analogy, and the experience was unique for him. He asked why individuals went about in modern communities in nearly perfect security from assault and robbery without any need to bear arms. His answer was the policeman. And from that, he went on to the question of what was needed for states and nations to get their ways with the same blissful immunity from violence and plunder. And it seemed to him a complete and reasonable answer to say an international policeman. And there you were. He did not see, he is probably quite incapable of seeing, that a state is something quite different in nature and behavior from an individual human being. When he was asked to explain how that international policeman was to be created and sustained, he just went on saying international policeman. He has been saying that for years. Sometimes it seems it is to be the League of Nations, sometimes the British Empire, sometimes an international air force, which is to undertake this grave responsibility. The bench before which the policeman is to hail the offender and this position of the lock up are not indicated. Finding our criticisms uncongenial, his lordship went off with his great idea, like a penguin which has found an egg, to incubate it alone. I hope he will be spared to say international policeman for many years to come, but I do not believe he has ever perceived or will ever perceive that. Brilliant as his inspiration was, it still left vast areas of the problem in darkness. Being a man of considerable means, he has been able to sustain a new Commonwealth movement and publish books and periodical in which his one great idea is elaborated rather than developed. But I will not deal further with very incoherent multitude that now echoes this word federation. Many among them will cease to cerebrate further, and fall by the wayside. But many will go on thinking, and if they go on thinking, they will come to perceive more and more clearly the realities of the case. Federation, they will feel, is not enough. So much for the present Federalist front. As a fundamental basis of action, as a declared end, it seems hopelessly vague and confused, and if one might coin a phrase, hopelessly optimistic. But since the concept seems to be the way to release a number of minds from belief in the sufficiency of a League of Nations, associated or not with British imperialism, it has been worthwhile to consider how it can be amplified and turned in the direction of that full and open-eyed worldwide collectivization, which a study of existing conditions obliges us to believe is the only alternative to the complete degeneration of our species. Chapter 8, the new type of revolution. Let us return to our main purpose, which is to examine the way in which we are to face up to this impending world revolution. To many minds, this idea of revolution is almost inseparable from visions of street barricades made of paving stones and overturned vehicles, ragged mobs armed with impromptu weapons and inspired by defiant songs, prisons broken, and a general jail delivery, palaces stormed, a great hunting of ladies and gentlemen, decapitated but still beautiful heads on pikes, regicides of the most sinister quality, the busy guillotine, a crescendo of disorder ending in a whiff of grapeshot. That was one type of revolution. It is what one might call the Catholic type of revolution. That is to say, it is the ultimate phase of the long period of Catholic living and teaching. People do not realize this, and some will be indignant at its being stated so barely, yet the facts stare us in the face. Common knowledge not to be denied. That furious, hungry, desperate, brutal mob was the outcome of generations of Catholic rule, Catholic morality, and Catholic education. The King of France was the most Christian king, the eldest son of the church. He was master of the economic and financial life of the community, and the Catholic Church controlled the intellectual life of the community and the education of the people absolutely. That mob was the outcome. It is absurd to parrot that Christianity has never been tried. Christianity in its most highly developed form has been tried and tried again. It was tried for centuries, fully and completely in Spain, France, Italy. It was responsible for the filth and chronic pestilence and famine of medieval England. It inculcated purity, but it never inculcated cleanliness. Catholic Christianity had particularly unchallenged power in France for generations. It was free to teach as it chose, and as much as it chose, it dominated the common life entirely. The Catholic system in France cannot have reaped anything it did not sow, for no other sowers were allowed. That hideous mob of murderous ragamuffins we are so familiar with in pictures of the period was the final harvest of its regime. The more Catholic reactionaries revile the insurgent common people of the First French Revolution, the more they condemn themselves. It is the most impudent perversion of reality for them to snivel about the guillotines and the timbrels as though they were not purely Catholic products, as though they came in suddenly from outside to wreak a genteel paradise. They were the last stage of the systematic injustice and ignorance of a strictly Catholic regime. One phase succeeded another with relentless logic. The Marseillaise completed the life cycle of Catholicism. In Spain, too, and in Mexico, we have seen undisputed educational and moral Catholic ascendancy of the Church with a free hand, producing a similar uprush of blind resentment. The crowds there also were cruel and blasphemous, but Catholicism cannot complain, for Catholicism hatched them. Priests and nuns, who had been the sole teachers of the people, were insulted and outraged, and churches defiled. Surely, if the church is anything like what it claims to be, the people would have loved it. They would not have behaved as though sacrilege was a gratifying relief. But these Catholic revolutions are only specimens of one single type of revolution. A revolution need not be a spontaneous storm of indignation against intolerable indignities and deprivations. It can come from quite other forms. As a second variety of revolution, which is in sharp contrast with the indignation revolt, in which so many periods of unchallenged Catholic ascendancy have ended, we may take what we may call the revolution conspiracy, in which a number of people set about organizing the forces of discomfort and resentment and loosening the grip of the government's forces in order to bring about a fundamental change of system. The idea of this type is the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, provided it is a little simplified and misunderstood. This, reduced to a working theory by its advocates, is conceived of as a systematic cultivation of a public state of mind favorable to a revolution, together with an inner circle of preparation for a seizure of power. Quite a number of communists and other leftist writers, bright young men without much political experience, have let their imaginations loose upon the technique of such an adventure. They have brought the Nazi and fascist revolutions into the material for their studies. Modern social structure, with its concentration of directive information and coercive power about radio stations, telephone exchangers, newspaper offices, police stations, arsenals, and the like, lends itself to quasi-gangster exploitation of this type. There is a great rushing about and occupation of key centers and organized capture, imprisonment, or murder of possible opponents, and the country is confronted with a fait accompli. The regimentation of the more or less reluctant population follows. But a revolution need be neither an explosion nor a coup d'etat. And the revolution that lies before us now as the only hopeful alternative to chaos, either directly or after an interlude of world communism, is to be attained, if it is attained at all, by neither of these methods. The first is too rhetorical and chaotic and simply leads to a champion and tyranny. The second is too conspiratorial and leads through an obscure struggle of masterful personalities to a similar end. Neither is lucid enough and deliberate enough to achieve a permanent change in the form and texture of human affairs. An altogether different type of revolution may or may not be possible. No one can say that it is possible unless it is tried. But one cannot say with assurance that unless it can be achieved, the outlook of mankind for many generations at least is hopeless. The new revolution aims essentially at a change in directive ideas. In its completeness, it is an untried method. It depends for its success upon whether a sufficient number of minds can be brought to realize that the choice before us now is not a choice between further revolution or more or less reactionary conservatism, but a choice between so carrying on and so organizing the process of change in our affairs as to produce a new world order, or suffering an entire and perhaps irreparable social collapse. Our argument throughout has been that things have gone too far ever to be put back again to any similitude of what they have been. We can no more dream of remaining where we are than think of going back in the middle of a dive. We must go through with these present changes, adapt ourselves to them, adjust ourselves to the plunge, or be destroyed by them. We must go through these changes just as we must go through his ill-conceived war, because there is as yet no possible end of it. There will be no possible way of ending it until the new revolution defines itself. It is patched up now without a clear-headed settlement understood and accepted throughout the world. We shall have only the simulacrum of peace. A patched up peace now will not even save us from the horrors of war. It will postpone them only to aggravate them in a few years' time. You cannot end this war yet. You can at best adjourn it. The reorganization of the world has at first to be mainly the work of a movement or a party or a religion or a cult, whatever we choose to call it. We may call it new liberalism or new radicalism or whatnot. It will not be a close-knit organization towing the party line and so forth. It may be a very loose-knit and many-faceted, but if a sufficient number of minds throughout the world, irrespective of race, origin, or economic and social habitations, can be brought to the free and candid recognition of the essentials of the human problem, then their effective collaboration in a conscious, explicit, and open effort to reconstruct human society will ensue. And to begin with, they will do all they can to spread and perfect the conception of a new world order, which they will regard as the only working frame for their activities, while at the same time they will set themselves to discover and associate with themselves everyone everywhere who is intellectually able to grasp the same broad ideas and morally disposed to realize them. The distribution of this essential conception one might call propaganda, but in reality it is education. The opening phase of this new type of revolution might involve, therefore, a campaign for reinvigorated and modernized education throughout the world, an education that will have the same ratio to the education of a couple of hundred years ago as the electric lighting of contemporary city has to the chandeliers and oil lamps of the same period. On its present mental levels, humanity can do no better than what it is doing now. Vitalizing education is only possible when it is under the influence of people who are themselves learning. It is indispensable for the modern idea of education that it should be knit to incessant research. We may research rather than science. It is the better word because it is free from any suggestion of that finality which means dogmatism and death. All education tends to become stylistic and sterile unless it is kept in close touch with experimental verification and practical work. And consequently, this new movement of revolutionary initiative must at the same time be sustaining realistic political and social activities and working steadily for the collectivization of governments and economic life. The intellectual movement will be the only initiatory and correlating part of the new revolutionary drive. These practical activities must be various. Everyone engaged in them must be thinking for himself and not waiting for orders. The only dictatorship he will recognize is the dictatorship of the plain understanding and the invisible fact. And if this culminating revolution is to be accomplished, then the participation of every conceivable sort of human being who has the mental grasp to see these broad realities of the world situation and the moral quality to do something about it must be welcomed. Previous revolutionary thrusts have been vitiated by bad psychology. They have been great play to the gratification of the inferiority complexes that arise out of class disadvantages. It is no doubt very unjust that anyone should be better educated, healthier, and less fearful of the world than anyone else. But that is no reason why the new revolution should not make the fullest use of the wealth, education, vigor, and courage of the fortunate. The revolution we are contemplating will aim at abolishing the bitterness of frustration. But certainly it will do nothing to avenge it. Nothing whatever. Let the dead past punish its dead. It is one of the most vicious streaks in the Marxist teaching to suggest that all people of wealth and capacity living in a community in which uncoordinated private enterprise plays a large part are necessarily demoralized by the advantages they enjoy, and that they must be disposed by the worker and peasant who are presented as endowed with a collective virtue capable of running all the complex machinery of a modern community. But the starting truth of the matter is that an uncoordinated scramble between individuals and nations alike demoralizes all concerned. Everyone is corrupted. The filching tramp by the roadside, the servile hand-kissing peasant of Eastern Europe, the dull-bribed loafer, as much as the woman who marries for money, the company promoter, the industrial organizer, the rent-exacting landlord, and the diplomatic agent. When the social atmosphere is tainted, everyone is ill. Wealth, personal freedom, and education may and do produce wasters and oppressive people, but they may also release creative and administrative minds to opportunity. The history of science and invention before the 19th century confirms this. On the whole, if we are to assume there is anything good in humanity at all, it is more reasonable to expect it to appear when there is most opportunity. And in further confutation of the Marxist caricature of human motives, we have a very considerable number of young people drawn from the middle class and upper class homes who figure in the extreme left movement everywhere. It is their moral reaction to the stuffiness and social ineffectiveness of their parents and their own sort of people. They seek an outlet for their abilities that is not gainful but serviceable. Many have sought an honorable life and often found it and death with the struggle with it in the struggle against the Catholics and their Moorish and fascist helpers in Spain. It is a misfortune of the generation that so many of them have fallen into the mental traps of Marxism. It has been my absurd experience to encounter noisy meetings of expensive young men at Oxford, not one of them stunted physically as I was by 20 years of undernourishment and devitalized upbringing, all pretending to be rough-hewn, collarless proletarians and shocked revolt against my bourgeois tyranny in the modest comfort of my declining years, and reciting the ridiculous class war phrases by which they protected their minds from any recognition of the realities of the case. But though that attitude demonstrates the unstimulating education of their progeny, preparatory and public schools, which had thrown them thus uncritical and emotional into the problems of the undergraduate life, it does not detract from the fact that they had found the idea of abandoning themselves to a revolutionary reconstruction of society that promised to end its enormous waste of potential happiness and achievement extremely attractive, notwithstanding that their own advantages seemed to be reasonably secure. Faced with the immediate approach of discomfort and dignity and wasted years, mutilation, death is soon over, but one wakes up again to mutilation every morning because of this ill-conceived war. Faced also by the reversion of Russia to autocracy and the fiscal extinction of most of the social advantages of their families, these young people with a leftish twist are likely not only to do some very profitable re-examination of their own possibilities, but also to find themselves joined in that re-examination by a very considerable number of others who have hitherto been repelled by the obvious foolishness and insincerity of the hammer and sickle symbols, workers and peasants of Oxford, and the exasperating dogmatism of orthodox Marxists. And may not these young people, instead of waiting to be overtaken by an insurrectionary revolution from which they will emerge greasy, unshaven, class-conscious, and in incessant danger of liquidation, decide that before the revolution gets a hold of them, they will get a hold of the revolution and save it from inefficiency, mental distortions, disappointments, and frustrations that have overtaken it in Russia? This new and complete revolution we contemplate can be defined in very few words. It is A, outright world socialism, scientifically planned and directed, plus B, a sustained insistence upon law based on a fuller, more jealously conceived resentment of the personal rights of man, plus C, the completest freedom of speech, criticism, and publication, and sedulous expansion of the educational organization to the ever-growing demands of the new order. What we may call the Eastern or Bolshevik collectivism, the revolution of the Internationale, has failed to achieve even the first of these three items, and it has never attempted the other two. Putting it at its compactest, it is the triangle of socialism, law, and knowledge which frames the revolution which may yet save the world. Socialism becomes outright collectivist. Very few men of the more fortunate classes in our old collapsing society who are still over 50 will be able to readjust their minds to that. It will seem an entirely repulsive suggestion to them. The average age of the British cabinet at the present time is well over 60, but it need not be repulsive at all to their sons. They will be impoverished anyhow. The stars in their courses are seeing to that, and that will help them greatly to realize that an administrative control to administrative participation and then to direct administration are easy steps. They are being taken now, first in one manner and then in another, on both sides of the Atlantic, reluctantly and often very disingenuously, and against energetic but diminishing resistances. Great Britain, like America, may become a socialist system with a definite revolution protesting all the time that it is doing nothing of the sort. In Britain, we have no distinctively educated class, but all up and down the social scale are well-read men and women who have thought intensely upon these great problems we have been discussing. To many of them, and maybe to enough of them, to start the avalanche of purpose that will certainly devolve from a clear and determined beginning, this conception of revolution to evoke a liberal collectivized world may appeal. And so at last we narrow down our inquiry to an examination of what the movement or its party, so far as it may use the semblance of party, will do, what its policy will be. Hitherto, we have been demonstrating why a reasonable man of any race or language anywhere should become a Western revolutionary. We have now to review the immediate activities to which he can give himself. All right, we will stop here, everybody. It's been about 40 minutes. Let's get in the chat. We've got Corbin, GF, and Tricky Woo. Hello, everyone. Make sure to tune in next week, same time, same day, for Chapter 9, Politics for the Sane Man. It's Todd Lewis, the Praise of Fly podcast, signing off.